If you look at the book of Judges, you will see there's a very interesting cycle of sin. And you look at the book of Judges, the first and the second chapter, they mention a cycle that is continuously happening among the judges. And that cycle we'll be looking at during the next couple of weeks. We'll be breaking it down, each cycle, one thing at a time. And we're going to, if you go home and you look at your word, you'll see that Judges chapter 1 and Judges chapter 2, they begin to identify the cycle of sin that the judges entered into. And as you see and as you read the word of God, you will begin to wonder, how can these people, how can the Israelites, despite knowing the Lord, despite having the word of God in their heart and having the word of God taught in their homes, how can they keep making the same mistake? We would say that about anybody. If anybody makes the same mistake, we would call them a sinner. Yeah. We call them different things. But we would not expect a person to make a mistake again and again. And we see the Judges chapter 1 and chapter 2 identifying a cycle of sin that the Israelites kept following generation after generation. And that is the very important word. Generation after generation, the cycle of sin begins to happen among the Israelites. And God in His mercy begins to intervene at different points of time in their lives. And as we begin to criticize them, we begin to see in our own lives the cycle of sin being repeated, not generation after generation, but sometimes week after week, a month after day, and in some cases, day after day. We will see that we begin in a very beautiful place where God has called us. We are so happy, we are so blessed, and we start off our Sunday, we start off our week in a great manner. But as the week progresses, as the day progresses, we move away from God. And today we're going to look at the cycle of sin. We're going to look at the first thing that the Judges in the book of Judges begins to identify is a sin that the Israelites committed. You know what is sin? Sin is separation from God, yes, but sin is actually a broken heart. Many times when we say sin, we begin to say fear. We connect sin with fear. We are afraid. When Adam sinned, he was afraid. When Eve sinned, she was afraid. And there's an emotion of fear that comes within us, those who sin. You know why? Because we are afraid of the consequences. But we forget to understand what is sin. Sin is a broken heart. Sin is a broken heart. Whose broken heart? God's broken heart. We come to a place where we start with fear. God comes to a place where He begins with a broken heart. Sin is God's broken heart. Sin is a broken covenant. If you go to Judges and you see in the book of Judges 1 and chapter 1 and chapter 2, and I encourage you during this week, read the word of God, study the word of God, meditate on the word of God, and you will see that the sin that the Israelites had committed was they broke covenant with God. What are some of how did they sin? And we're going to just look at different things that they did. First thing is, you go to chapter 1 and verses 27 to 33. Chapter 1 verses 27 to 33. God had commanded the Israelites to destroy and drive out the people in the land in which God had given them as a promise. But you read the 27th to the 32nd verse, you will see again and again it being repeated that the Israelites, in different tribes of the Israelites, it says in the 27th verse, Manasseh did not drive out. 29th verse, Ephraim did not drive out. In the 30th, Zebulun did not drive out. 31, Asher did not drive out. And you begin to read in the 33rd verse also, it says, and Naphtali did not drive out. And you see this picture of God giving a command to the Israelites where the inheritance, the promised land into which into which they go and which God has given them, they need to do something. They need to drive out the people of the land. They need to destroy everything in that land. And we think that is very cruel. But the thing is, God's commands are for our blessing. Obedience is better than sacrifice. Obedience equals blessing. When God asked the Israelites to drive out people from that land and then accept that inheritance, there is a reason, because God knows that the Israelites are very weak of heart. They will be manipulated, they will be corrupted, and they will become like the people who live in the land. And we see the Israelites, because they did not drive out the people of that land, you know what they did instead? When they were in Egypt, they were slaves, right? When the Israelites were in Egypt, they were slaves. When they came into the new land and they conquered the land, they said, now we can have slaves ourselves. And you read that 27 to 33rd verse, you will see how each tribe, instead of driving out the people of the land, keep the people in the land and make them their slaves. And later on, because they kept them in the land, they were corrupted by the practices of those very slaves. When God says obey, obey. There is no second chance, there is no second option. John chapter 15 verses 14, what does it say? John chapter 15, 14, what does it say? It says, you are my friends. You are my friends. In the Old Testament, God gives a command to obey. They did not understand why. In the New Testament, Jesus gives a commandment to obey, and he gives the reason. He says there's a relationship that is being built, and that relationship is called a relationship of friendship. You are my friends if you do what I command. And when many times we make compromises with God's commandments because we want to see how well does it satisfy my own life in this world. There are things in this world that we want to do. There are things that we want to avoid. There are things that we want to say. We want to say, what's wrong with that? You know, often the question in the when people come to the Lord, to come to Jesus, is they ask the question, what is wrong with that? Is it wrong to do this? Is it wrong to do that? And we are basically testing the limits of God. How much can I go? We are always testing the limits of God. Is it wrong? Is it wrong? Is it wrong? God is not talking about whether it is right or wrong. God is talking about our relationship. I give you the command because I see the bigger picture. You disobey the command because you see the present today. Take any commandment of Jesus. Take any commandment of God. Why do we disobey those commandments? For the Israelites, they disobeyed the commandments because they were getting slaves for free. For the Israelites, they were disobeying the commandments because it required less task. It required less task to destroy. It took less task to destroy than to actually destroy. And so they said, let us live peacefully. There are people God has said we should not associate with, because God knows they will manipulate, they will corrupt our thinking. But we'll say, let us live in peace. God's peace is not a corrupt peace. God's peace is a wholesome peace. Amen. Amen. And so here we see the Israelites' first sin that they did was they did not drive out. And the second sin that they did was they did not teach. You go to the 2nd chapter and the 10th verse. Judges chapter 2 and verses 10. It says, after that whole generation had been gathered to their fathers, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. Now here is another generation in Israel rising up, and this generation, the prominence of this generation is this: they did not know God. They did not know what he has done for Israel. And I ask the question, why? We might not understand this, but the Israelites had been given specific commands by God. Last Sunday we heard the children recite the 10 commandments. Yes? They had been given specific commandments by God. And those commandments were put into place so that they can teach their children. They can pass their faith from one generation to another generation. Now what is the commandment? Honor the Sabbath day. One of the commandments, right? In the Old Testament, honor the Sabbath day. But what happens in the Sabbath day? In the Sabbath day, the parents and the children together go and worship the Lord. And in their worship, they're reminding themselves of what God has done for them in Egypt. and brought them out of Egypt and brought them into this promised land. They're remembering the covenant of God on the Sabbath day. And why did they not teach their children? Because they did not honor the Sabbath day. And in the New Testament we see there were people, God had asked the people to come together at an appointed time, meet together, worship the Lord. And there were some people even in the New Testament who are not coming together. And Paul says, listen, do not give up the gathering together of brethren as the time draws near. And so we see in the Old Testament people giving up the Sabbath day. We see in the New Testament people giving up the getting together of the local congregation. And God says that is wrong. God says that is wrong, because many times we ask ourselves, what is wrong? What if I miss one Sunday? What is going to happen? The Israelites missed one Sunday. They missed a second Sunday. Then their children decided not to make Sunday a day of Sabbath. Another thing about the Israelites, every year they had festivals, and those festivals were not to simply celebrate. Those festivals were festivals to remind their children about the story of God. They were reminding themselves during the Passover. They were reminding themselves during the Jubilee year. They were reminding themselves during every festival that the Israelites had. They were reminding their children and themselves about what God has done in the past. They did not celebrate their festivals, because of which their children did not know the story. Their children did not know their God. Sin is when we do not teach our children. When we do not teach our faith, pass down our faith to the next generation. And I want to tell you this very simply. Many of you are here because your parents were very, very strict about attending church. But today we have made excuses about attending church and fellowshipping together with believers. We have made excuses. If we have a job, we say immediately, I cannot go to church. If you're sick, I will not go to church. If I have a headache, I will not go to church. We will make any and every excuse for not attending church, for not getting together as in a fellowship. But will we make the same excuse for our jobs? There's a very great danger that we stand when we sin and do not teach our children about the faith that we have. And I tell you this very clearly. Read the history about other countries, European countries, that once upon a time had this faith of God. Today their churches are empty. Their churches are empty because their parents have not passed down the faith to the next generation, and the children have decided the Sunday service is not an important thing. The coming together of brothers and believers is not an important thing. The cycle of sin, we have touched one aspect, and that is the topic of sin.